What's up everybody? Today I'm going to be covering my photo editing workflow for street photography images. For this tutorial we're going to be covering all the global adjustments done in Lightroom. We're going to bring it into Photoshop, cover dodging and burning, Orton effect, any finishing touches, object removal, bring it back into Lightroom, sharpness, vignetting, and all those little things that make your image pop. As far as software, what you're going to need is a copy of Lightroom, Photoshop, and Raya Pro. Raya Pro is a plugin that I use for Photoshop. It helps speed up the process as far as luminosity masks when you take bracketed images. As far as hardware, you're going to need your computer, of course, mouse, keyboard, and a Wacom tablet is ideal for the dodging and burning, anything where you're painting in, little brush strokes, anything where you have to do detailed touches. So let's pull the image up here and take a look at what we will be working towards. So this image is taken on Ocean Drive. It's at the Starlight Hotel. And as you can see, it is a very stylized edit. This color is actually more red in reality, and the blue here is a little bit more regular blue, not so much teal. This is a recent kind of style that I've been going for as far as my street photography with the whole quarantine. I've been pretty much just shooting locally, whatever I could find, and just getting really creative with what I have to work with here. It was taken on a rainy day, as you can see. We have a nice reflection of the lights here. I think this is a car going by, so it was sort of a long expo. You can see the blur in the tree here. And it is cropped, I think a 16:9. I might have cropped it down a little bit. I didn't really go for the 4:5 that I usually go for Instagram, because it would have cropped too much of up here and lost too much of this reflection down here. So for Instagram I would just make a separate edit for that and just crop it in a little bit smaller. There was no focus stacking done here. It was all done in one shot because there's nothing really that I had to focus for in the immediate foreground. Pretty much just focused for this area here, and if you look, it's a small image, so you can't really, let me go to this one. So as we look in the distance, it's still pretty sharp back there. This is the one of the raw images, of course, and all this is pretty sharp. So this was taken at f8. So at f8 you can get pretty much everything in focus, as long as you don't have anything down here that you're trying to get or anything too far away in the distance. As you can see here, we have 2 brackets. I probably shot 3, but the third overexposed one really didn't have any purpose. I could bring out the shadows pretty well here. And this one, the dark exposure, is pretty much just for these extremely bright neons. As you can see, this is the original color. It's kind of red and blue, and here is the edited version, very pink and teal, which are like sort of Miami Vice colors. It's kind of the style that I've been working around with. And so these are images. So we're going to work primarily on our base exposure here. First thing I like to do is apply the profile lens corrections to get rid of all the vignetting and distortion. This was shot with a wide angle lens at 10 millimeters, the widest, so we had a little bit of distortion and quite a bit of vignetting. So fix that real quick. Then we'll go over here to our basic edits, change it into Adobe Landscape to make the colors pop. You can see the difference there. And then we will bring down the highlights a little bit. We don't have to worry about recovering too much because we have our dark exposure here, which will take care of that. We want to have this one sort of even, so I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Bring the shadows up. Since this is going to be the only bright exposure that we have, I'm going to bring the shadows all the way. Usually I would try to avoid that because you risk getting halos in certain areas, but it doesn't look like we're getting much of that here. And I might bring the whole exposure up a little bit just to have a nice, good, even base. As far as our white balance, as you can see, it's quite yellow, and in our final image it's more on the blue side here. So I'm going to cycle through some of these presets. So I'm liking the fluorescent white balance setting here. We get a lot of blue. This was sort of shot at twilight, just after sunset, so it wasn't completely dark, but we got the blue sky before it turned to black. So I'm liking this. Moving on, we're going to move the clarity slider over here to the left. This will get the beginning of our dreamy Orton Blur kind of effect going on. You can see the difference here. Just softens everything. We're going to add some more to all the highlight areas here in Photoshop. So this was just getting us there at the beginning. Now, the key to getting this pink and teal effect that I've been doing here is adjusting the calibration tab here. Normally under most conditions, when I'm shooting landscapes and seascapes and anything with really natural colors, I don't mess with these too much. If you like that orange and teal trendy Instagrammer look, you can use a lot of these sliders to kind of get that look, and with other tweaks over here in the HSL slider, but this will kind of get you started. So as we turn this blue calibration slider to the left, we see that we're getting the teal that we're looking for here. So it's affecting only or mostly the blues. So I'm going to move that a little bit halfway. This will affect our greens, which we don't have too many greens in this image. So I like it how it warms it up a little bit. So I might move that a little bit to the right. And this will start to get our pink color. The problem is when you mess with these calibration sliders too much, it adds a lot of saturation, which I'll have to pull back later in the HSL slider. But it helps with getting a little bit of that pink tone, magenta tone thing started. So I'll move that over here slightly. Do a little before and after. We're already on our way to getting this image. You can see the blacks are lifted. That's obviously going to be in the final steps. But we're getting pretty close here to begin. And these yellows, you can see I turned them very much orange, and that's also in the HSL tab. So we're going to close that for now, go over to HSL, which is hue, saturation, and luminance. And with the hue sliders, you can adjust the hue of each of these individual colors in the image. So it's a very selective adjustment. So for example, anything that is sort of red, which looks like it's pretty much just these lights here, and we want to make them more orange, we move that to the left. Our oranges are also in that same area, so we're going to slightly move those to the left. Yellows, not very present, a little bit in the trees here, but we still want those a little bit more on the orange side. Greens, really not a lot of greens here, so I'm going to leave that alone. This is going to make it a little bit more aqua blue, which I don't want to overdo it in these first few steps. So I might just add a tiny bit there and leave that as is, because we're going to be messing with the split toning, and that will further add some of this blue aqua tone in the shadows, and so we don't want to overdo it on these first few adjustments. Now, to further adjust this is pretty pink as is, but as you can see, there are different shades from the reflection and the light as it fades off on the building here. So right now, all these are kind of blue, and this will turn that more pink. Now this is going to help when I add the blue to the shadows. It's going to make the overall image too blue, so I'm going to have to use this to bring back a little bit of the pink magentas. So I'm going to just start out moving that off a little bit to this side. And this is where we can really adjust the red from what it originally was to more purple than pink on this side. So for now, I'm just going to move that a little bit to the left and just make it a little bit more pink than red. So we cycle back and forth. We can see we're already doing some good stuff here. Look at this one over here. Obviously we have more detail in these highlights, which we'll take from this dark frame. All right, so we'll close that, move into split toning. And split toning, as the name suggests, lets you add certain hues or colors to the highlights and certain to the shadows. Now the key here is to always, I mean, there's no rules, but generally you want to have contrasting colors in the highlights and in the shadows. Now you'd have to look at a color wheel to really get an idea of how this works, but now that I'm explaining it, I guess might as well open one up just to explain the theory. So color theory probably deserves a whole video in itself, but this little color wheel will kind of get you an idea of what I'm talking about. So as we look here, we can see colors that are called complementary and primary colors. Primary colors are the basis of all these complementary colors. The primary colors are blue, yellow, and red, from which when you mix those, you can get purple, yellow and red gets you orange, yellow and blue gets you green. So basically, what works really well is having a color in the highlights and then its opposites here in the shadows. That's why that teal and orange look is very popular, because they're opposites here on the color wheel. Now, what I do with this teal and pink tone, they're not exactly opposites, but they're not exactly next to each other, so they will contrast, but not as much as if I was doing, let's say, a teal and orange, but that is not the look I'm going for, so that's why I'm not doing that. But you can mess with the different colors on the color wheel and figure out your own personal style from there. So, red and green contrast very well. You'll see that in grungy movies, David Fincher movies or something. He uses a lot of yellow in the highlights also. So anyways, not to get too much into the bushes, that was a little 101 on the color wheel. So we'll move to our split toning highlights, and if you hold Alt, you will see the color that you are adding to the image here. So I don't want to add too much of the pink to the highlights, because, for example, this blue highlight will also get colored in as well. But I do want to make sure that there is that contrast in the highlights and in the shadows. So I'm going to add this, and as you can see, we are really oversaturating and blowing out the colors here. I'm going to bring those back in the HSL, and it's really a balancing act, because you add one, and then you add another effect, and another effect, and then you have to pull back the saturation and kind of go through the whole process again. So we're going to just start out doing this basic first pass here. So I want a kind of bluish teal for the shadows, but not too green. So I want to go all the way sort of to the indigo and then pull it back to just about there. And as I drag the saturation slider, which is how much of this color it is actually adding, we can see we lose a lot of the pink warm colors almost immediately. So as I add a little bit of that, I add a little bit more up here. And then if you flick this switch for this tab, you will see the before and after of the effect you're adding for only this tab. Just like the slash does it for the entire image. As we can see, it's almost too magenta, too pink right now. And then adding that blue makes it a cooler image, cooler in temperature, not as in coolness. And still, by adding this pink in the highlights, we still maintain this pink, which we will turn down in just a second. As you can see, the colors are just crazy here, and if you look at the histogram, you can see they're peaking up here too. So I'm going to go back to the HSL, and this time I'm going to go to the saturation tab, which is similar to the hue, except it's adding or subtracting saturation for each of these individual colors. So I don't have too many problems with the reds here, or the oranges. I think those are all fine. It's really these magentas that we got to pull back. The magenta and the purple, but more the magenta. So we're going to pull this back till about here, so we can actually start to see the wall again. So you can see when you blow out that color, you can't even see any details. It's almost like increasing the exposure too much. So that brings back a lot of that. And then this is more for the spill up here. But we're going to bring that back a little bit too. Keep in mind that these adjustments really just affect the base colors of the image. The split toning adds this on top, right? So for example, if I was to completely desaturate the image, the split toning is still affecting the image. It is not affected by any desaturation adjustments. You can see this is a pretty cool effect if you want to do some stylized black and white images. You can just have something over here in the highlights, and then, well, I'll just increase the saturation so you can kind of see what I'm talking about for the highlights, and then have something else for the shadows. And you can get some really interesting black and white images out of that, though that is not what we're doing in this image, so I won't bring that back. All right, so a little before and after on that. It's pretty evenly toned. I think we are good on the saturation here. It's a little bit too much on this side. Let me see if I can bring that back. And when you're adjusting these, you want to kind of go over too much to one side and then bring it back and then find that middle ground, which seems to be something like that. And this image is overall a lot darker because it's kind of that night photography kind of vibe. So we're going to be adjusting that later. You can see it's a lot brighter up here. But I think we're good. I think I might have taken too much of the color away. So I'm going to bring that back. See if we have to adjust anything with this split toning. Sometimes you can go back to the calibration and further tweak that. Again, some weird artifacts here from the oversaturation. So I want to avoid that, but I still want that teal color, which is still, it's looking a little blue right now. So I might go over here and adjust the hue. Looks like it's more of the blue one here, just to make it a little bit more teal rather than a light blue. And the colors are looking good. So from here, what I will do is select the darker exposure and then sync the adjustments. Make sure you have check all. These little check marks, if you have something that you don't want synced to the other image, you can deselect them. But for this tutorial, we'll sync all the edits. And then we'll go over here because we don't want exactly all the edits that we had here, as you know, as far as bringing up the exposure. We want this to still be our dark frame. And as you can see in this image, you can really see the actual neon tube in here, which is kind of what we want. We can see it a little bit in this one. Let me see something here. You can see it a little bit in our final image here. So we definitely use that exposure for that. And it's just really blown out in some of the areas here. So we want to make sure we can see that neon tube, even in this area. So adjust this a little bit and make sure those highlights are nice and low. And pretty much we will only be taking the sign from this exposure. So I wouldn't worry so much about anything else that's going on here. So that's looking good. Next step is to highlight these two. Right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop, and we're going to jump into Photoshop for the second round of edits. All right, we have our 2 layers loaded up. First thing we want to do is check the alignment, because anything that we're going to be doing here, the images have to be perfectly on top of each other, which if you're in the field and you accidentally bump the tripod, or if it's just a situation where there's movement, there might be a little misalignment, but this is looking good. So first I'm going to talk about the plugin I mentioned. It's called Raya Pro. If you go into Window, Extensions, we can see the Raya Pro hub here. It's got a lot of features. The only one that I really use is the precision masks, but it can do all these things, which I haven't really messed with. So it's a very useful plugin. This is the precision mask menu. And basically, you can either take your, if I had a bright exposure, put it on top here, and click Auto Bright to apply the masks to the Auto Bright to the bright layer, or in this case, I'm taking my dark layer, putting it on top, and I'm going to click Auto Dark. And what it does is it creates a series of masks in descending strength, where it analyzes the brighter areas and the darker areas. And so, for example, if I use the Auto Dark here, some of the masks will only affect the light, the sign here, the light from the sign, and then as the masks get stronger, some of them might darken the sky or whatever other bright areas we have in this image. So the easiest way to explain that is just by clicking it and showing you how it works. So looking in the folder here, we have our 6 masks that it creates, and by default it always starts with the first one. As I click these numbers, you can see less and less of the mask being used. So the first mask, and you can look at it visually here, the darker areas are not included in the mask and the brighter areas are. As you can see, it is affecting, and you can use the hide reveal button here, it's affecting the sign and the sky, and this car streaking by here and some of these lights. Now I kind of like this, so I don't really want to mask that out. So let's try number 2. Number 2 is a dramatic difference here, as you can see, and it really just affects a little bit of the sky and the signs. And you can see how much detail it brings back from the sign here. If I zoom in, you can see those neon tubes very clearly, where this is our original exposure, and this is bringing those highlight details back. Now I'm going to cycle through the other options, even though I'm leaning towards 2 on this one, just to see. Now 3 does just the sign and some of these back here. 4, a little bit less, 5, and then ultimately 6 is doing literally just that, and then these lights here, of course. But I want to darken this sky a little bit, because with the long exposure, it makes it seem like it was earlier in the day than it actually was. And if we look at our target image here, you can see it's a lot darker. So I definitely used one of the stronger masks. And I think in addition to that, I selected the sky and darkened it, which I'll show you how we do that in a second. So even though I don't like how it's affecting this over here, I could easily just paint, because I'll use this as a starting point for the masking, and then I'll further paint in or paint out with the brush parts of the mask that I don't want it to affect or that I do. So what are we on? 2. So while 1 might be too much, 2 gives me a little bit of the sky darkened and the sign, and then I'll just paint out this section here because I don't want it to be included in the mask. It's also getting some of the highlights from the reflection. So once you have your mask selected or picked out, you click the select button, the rest of them will disappear, and you have your 1 layer here. So now we will grab the brush, have opacity at about 15, make sure you have the mask selected, and the black removes the mask, the white adds to the mask. In this situation, we're going to remove some of the mask, only for this area. So with the parentheses, the square parentheses button, you can adjust the size of the brush here and grab our Wacom tablet and start painting those out. Do a little before and after here. As we can see, it is now not affecting anything on this side, but is affecting some of those trees down there, which I don't really want it to because it's not overly bright anyways. So bring some of that back. And that's looking good. Now there are ways with working with layers where you're doing non-destructive editing, meaning you can always go back and change things, but I like to commit to my edits and it makes it easier on the file size as well. So once I'm satisfied with that layer, I'm going to go to here to layer and merge visible. That'll pretty much flatten the image. Then you save, make sure you save throughout your workflow, and then we'll move on to the next thing. All right, so once we have our layers combined, the next step before we dodge and burn and add the Orton Blur is distraction, object removal. You basically usually you check your edges first, which in this case it looks fine. There's nothing kind of poking in, but if there was like a leaf or if there was rocks or something here in the edges that might be distracting, you would remove that. This light is a little distracting to me, so might try removing that with the constant aware fill. And it's a little blurry, but it's not really something that you notice, so that looks better. This rock is a little distracting. And I might, if I was really working on this image, try to remove some of these signs, some of these wires and panels here, but that will make this tutorial a little bit too long. So I think that is fine for now. If we had people here, we would remove people. But I think that's all we need to do for object removal. Now before we continue, I think I'm going to crop the image down a little bit. Like I said, I'm not going to go for the Instagram crop, but I want to make it easier to do that later. So I'm going to crop anything that is pretty unnecessary here, probably to the edge of this reflection. And there we're a little bit tighter than a 16:9. So if later I want to make an Instagram version, I'll just type in my 4:5, and we're going to lose a little bit of the reflection, a little bit of this. I don't like cutting off the corner, but it's going to be a version strictly for Instagram, so that's what I would do in that situation. But in this case, we're not going to do that. Leave that as is. We're going to duplicate layer and commence our dodging and burning. Now, as far as dodging and burning, there's two methods. You can either use the dodge and burn tool, where the dodge will add highlights, as you can see, and the burn will make things darker. That's one way of doing it. The way I like to do it is duplicate the layer. You go to Image Adjustments, Curves, and you basically make a dark exposed version of that layer. And then you mask it out. Then you go to your paintbrush tool, opacity about 15, and pretty much anything where you don't want the eye to be drawn is going to be burned, aka darkened. So our highlights are this reflection, the sign, and then some of this here. Now this ordinarily might be a little distracting because your eye kind of goes here, here, and then kind of for some reason bounces around here. But I think for this composition, it kind of works because you have this triangle thing going on here. I'm going to darken the sky a little bit, and then any of these other areas out here, just darken it to make it a little bit more of a moody image. So I'm going to grab the Wacom tablet and start to paint in the burn layer. We'll do a little hide reveal to see how it's coming along. As you can see, it's almost adding a vignette to the image where your eye, where it has a dark ring around the outside and your eye is drawn here towards the sign and towards this area here in the middle. I might dodge some of this, so there's a little bit of a leading line even though there's no focal point at the end here, but this line and the crack in the sidewalk, or the line of the sidewalk, kind of goes into this direction, and these are both pointing in this direction. This would be a cool image maybe for if you had somebody, as far as like that candid street photography, you had somebody walking by maybe holding a bright colored umbrella or with a bright colored rain jacket, but there was nobody around when I took this image, and it is what it is. So do a little before and after there. It's looking pretty good. Next, you take your main layer, duplicate that, Control J, and you're going to do the same thing, but make a bright version. So you're going to go to Image Adjustments, Curves, and make a bright layer. So I'm going to be adding Orton Blur to this, so I'm not going to worry too much about dodging things, but I might bring out a little bit of this bright but still kind of dark area, and then a little bit of a line leading in towards the distance over here. And sometimes you want to remove areas of a dodge or burn where you might have gone a little too far. This dark spot here, I thought it was a overly burned part, but it looks like it's just dirty or something. Either way, try to take some of that out. Continue on with the dodging here. Sometimes you overdo it and you get like a weird kind of glow halo thing that you're not really going for. So you can just select the black and erase some of that. So that looks good. This image doesn't really require too much dodging and burning because it's pretty contrasty as is. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which is adding the Orton Blur. Control J, duplicate that again, and this time we're going to adjust the curves through the adjustment layer on this panel. You're going to put a point on the shadows on the lower end of this diagonal line, and if you were adjusting tone curve as we do in Lightroom, you would add 2 more points, but for the purpose of this, we're going to skip the middle because we want to bring up the highlights of the entire image. Because when you add Orton Blur, you're also adding a little bit of a highlight, kind of a burn, a dodge, as it were. You're going to click on this little button here, which will only affect the layer immediately below it. If you had more layers, this curves adjustment layer would affect all of those as well. You're going to go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and you can play with this radius. It affects how much blur it's adding, but I usually just leave it around 7 because you don't want to overdo it, but you still want to add that dreamy blur effect. So now we have this blurry layer, which we're going to Alt-click Create Mask to hide that, as we did with these other dodge and burn layers. Go back to our brush and make it nice and big, and then we're going to paint on top of all our highlights. The Orton effect works best on highlights and any edges where it's a contrasting edge between a highlight and a dark area is kind of where it shows the most. But in this case, I'm going to focus more on the lights and the reflection, maybe a little bit in this area. Not so much here because the light isn't very harsh, and so if you add blur to that, it'll look a little unnatural. And with these moody, rainy compositions, it helps a lot because sometimes you actually get streaks on the lens itself because you get drops and then you wipe it away, and that's actually how some of this blurry, streaky look came from, because it was raining and my lens obviously got wet. But that adds to the atmosphere of the image. There's a little spot here. It's probably a drop on the lens, which I don't particularly like, but it doesn't distract me enough to remove it. Plus it's a complex kind of area, so I'm not sure the content aware fill will work very well. So we're going to hide and reveal that layer to see our before and after. And you can see how much of a nice glow it adds, which when we add a further vignette to this in Lightroom, it's going to draw all your attention right here. And we're going to add a little bit of clarity in Lightroom as well, so we don't want to overdo this blurriness. I'm pretty happy with that because I also don't want to lose too much of the highlights that we did all that masking for. Maybe add a tiny bit here. Alright, so when we're done with our layers, we'll do a quick hide reveal just to see what we have done here so far. And it's looking pretty good. So I'm going to commit to these edits, go to Layer, Merge Visible. That will flatten the image, save. And that is it for our Photoshop work. We're going to close that and go back into Lightroom. Now as we look at these images, we can see, actually I didn't crop this one too much, but that's not a big deal because now as we look at our final image here, we can see we have the flat blacks and it's overall a darker image. The sky is brighter here, which I might have worked a little bit more in Photoshop, maybe a selective mask as I mentioned and darken that. But for the purpose of this tutorial, you get the idea. And I can always either bring the highlights down like this, or I can create a radial filter. And you want to make sure you avoid this part of the sign. And then you drop, then you go to invert, and then you drop the exposure. And that's where you can really see what is affecting. Actually, what you can do is get your whole area covered here, and then use the brush, and you go to select, show select mask overlay, and this red area is what it's affecting. So if we want to not affect this sign, you alt click and paint anywhere here with the sign. Make sure you have auto mask deselected. And then, as you can see, the red is not affecting the sign. It's a little bit on this side here, so I'll get rid of some of that. Okay, now we take that show select mask overlay button off. We will adjust to the point that I think it darkens a little bit. You can also paint back in some of these areas over here. And then you go to the range mask, you create a luminance mask, and this way you can avoid darkening any of the already dark areas like this palm tree here. And you can set the mask to what you like or what makes sense for the image. I think about halfway is ideal because we don't want to darken the palm trees too much, and it also saves a little bit of the building from getting darkened. And we can further adjust that, and then our sky is pretty close to what we have here. So from here I will begin to add the contrast, but I still want it a little bit flat or evenly exposed before I do that. We're going to add that extra little clarity, or subtract the clarity that I mentioned, which will add to the whole image. Well, before and after, starting to look a lot better already. So as far as the contrast, I like to use the tone curve here. So you create a point in the middle, and a point for the highlights up here, and a point for the shadows. Now the highlights look fine. Looking at the histogram, we could use a little bit more highlight. We don't want it to clip, and we don't want to lose our neons here, which looks like we still have the neons. the neon tubes, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. And then we're going to bring down the lower end here, which will darken the already dark areas. At the same time, we want to bring up this little end here, which will create that flat look. It's called raising the blacks. As you can see right now, it's very contrasty, and up here it's still contrasty, but we still retain some of the detail here in the shadows. I think I might have overdone the contrast. Yeah, this one is a little bit brighter. So we go back here, bring that up a little bit, and that looks a little bit closer. This one additionally has the vignette that I'll show you how we add. That's why it's darker around the outsides. But that's a good starting point right there. As you can see, raising the blacks basically cuts out this little area on the histogram, and like I said, it retains detail. We can also mess with our calibration a little bit more if I feel that it's not teal enough. I might add a little bit of that blue hue adjustment. What you'll notice is when you add contrast, it also adds saturation. And if you look at our first image here, we have all this detail here. And then as soon as we added that contrast, we got that overly saturated up in this area. So we're gonna have to go back into the HSL, pull back those magentas a little bit, and a tiny bit of the purple. Now, when you add this flat contrast look, it gives you the opportunity to add, in split toning, some color in the shadows, which in this case is going to be that blue teal color, because we want to maintain that kind of contrasting split tone look. But we already added some split toning earlier, so this is just a tiny bit added. Let's look at our comparison here. It's very slight. You almost can't notice it. But it's a combination of very slight edits that will give you the style, or that will define your style. So I'm going to add a little bit of that in the highlights back. Might be a little too much up there, so I'll bring that back. You can see a before and after, that overly saturated, and then something a little bit more normal. That's looking good. See if we can bump the highlights a little bit. But I don't want to bring that sky back too much. So if I bump up the highlights, I'm going to go back up here and make sure I'm bringing down that sky. All right, looking good. We're going to zoom out of this image a little bit and add a radial filter to the entire image. So I used to add vignettes using the effects tab here. Let me show you, get rid of this. And it adds a vignette to the whole thing, but the problem is you can't really adjust how it's affecting the dark areas, and it's really not very flexible. This method, using the radial filter, what it allows you to do is adjust the shape and the size and the placement. We want it a little bit up here. And then you can additionally create a luminance mask here where it'll only bring down the brighter areas, because you don't want to make the dark areas too dark, and then you'll lose detail in the shadows. Do a little before and after. It's also doing a before and after on our radial filter up here, so you're going to have to ignore that. You don't overdo it like those heavily vignetted Instagram images. We definitely want to draw your attention to the center. So do a little before and after on that. It's looking pretty good. I think the image might be a little too dark overall. It is very close to this though. As you can see, there's a little bit more blue in the shadows here. And something that I'm noticing is this blue over here is a little too much for me. So you can see it is kind of pulled back on this image. So we'll go to our HSL, locate that blue, and just pull it back a little bit. The problem is it's going to brighten that area. So you might have to go into the luminance, and you can darken the area that you pulled back. So I must have done something different here with the hues, because the blue reflection is looking a little different. But what I do like is that there's a little bit more blue up here in that top neon, which here it's a little bit whiter. Your edits are not going to be the same every time. You're going to kind of have a style as you work on this. But with so many minor adjustments, it's not going to be exactly the same every time. So I'm liking this image. What I do notice is that this is a little bit more magenta. And I think that comes from our split toning. Or what I could do is just go to our global adjustments and adjust the whole image. Though I don't really like that. The vignette is looking a little too strong for me. So I'm going to go over here, pull that back a little bit, and then raise the overall exposure of the image. Looks like our highlights are clipping a little bit. Bring that down. And you really have to look at the histogram when you do this, more than what your monitor tells you, because unless you calibrate your monitor regularly and you have it on a very dim setting, the exposure level here is not going to be exactly the same as what you see on a phone or when you post it to Instagram and all that. So we are a little bit brighter in this image, and so I could bring that down a tad. And I think I dodged and burned. I probably dodged some areas differently than the last time. But this is looking pretty good. So I'm going to call this the end. Lastly, what you want to do is add sharpening. So you can see it's pretty sharp already. Let me take it out. It's pretty sharp already, but especially if you're going to be printing this, these little bits of sharpening detail really help. So what you want to do is add a little bit of sharpening, then alt-click the mask slider, and everything that's white is going to have sharpening added to it. So for example, this would sharpen stuff in the clouds, which you don't want, and too many details here in the floor. We only really want that sign, maybe the tree, and any prominent areas here on the hotel. So once you got your mask set, you're going to zoom in a little bit. I usually sharpen or start off sharpening about 64 and then radius 1.4. Radius is the thickness of the sharpening line. We'll deselect this to see how much it's adding, and you can see it's adding a lot of the crispness over here in these bright areas, and you can really notice it on the edges of things. And if you overdo it, you'll see a haloing effect, but I think it's looking pretty good here. And then if you zoom out, you can see it's a very slight adjustment. It really helps only if you're pixel peep in your images. Now in this area, it looks like I might have added too much, so I'm going to pull back maybe to about 50. And that looks a little bit more normal. A little before and after on the whole thing, and it's looking pretty good. So let's do a little comparison here to where we started, which is going to be, let me create a virtual copy here and reset it. This is where we started. Not a bad image to start with, but we definitely changed the colors to that Miami teal and pink style, a lot of dodging and burning and adding shadows and making it a moodier image overall. So I'm liking how this came out. We do a comparison here. This one actually looks a little bit more flatter. But I think I might have overdone it anyways, so I'm going to leave it as is. So that's a wrap for this street photography photo editing tutorial. It's always good to look at how other people how other people's workflow is, and then maybe take a little part here and there that you can add to your own workflow. And everybody has their own signature style, but sometimes the way other people work kind of adds to your own editing style. I'm going to be putting out a few of these tutorials as we continue in this lockdown situation. Already put out the landscape and seascape editing. I'm also going to be putting together a Milky Way and Aurora editing tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. Make sure to like and subscribe for more of these type of tutorials and travel photography content. And until the next one, I'll see you then.